Alright everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. Hope you're all well and you're looking after yourselves on this Tuesday. So today's video is going to be another NRL Rivalries video. I think I'm up to part 10. I've lost count, there's so many rivalries. But tonight's video is going to be South Sydney against St George. So this isn't a fierce rivalry where both clubs hate each other, want to kill each other. This is more of a competitive rivalry which goes all the way back to the early days. So I'm going to be going through all the big moments, all the big matches. I'm going to be going through the head to head, and we're going to go into this rivalry a bit more in depth. Of course, it's between South Sydney and St George, two of the most successful clubs in New South Wales Rugby League NRL history. South Sydney have won 21 premierships. St George have won 15 as a standalone club, and as a joint venture with Illawarra they've won one as St George Illawarra, so that's 16 premierships in total. So I'm going to be going into the video very shortly, but before I do, I'd just like to say thank you to everyone that's subscribed to my channel. Welcome to all the new subscribers. If you haven't already done so, go back through and check all my NRL rivalry videos. I've made a ton of them, as I said. And thank you to everyone that supported me from the very beginning. Thank you for your ongoing support and your kind words. So let's get into this video, shall we? So St George and South Sydney, head to head, the two clubs have played 251 matches. That's South against St George and South against St George Illawarra combined. So 251 games. South Sydney's won 107. St George have won 135 matches, and there's been 9 draws. The first time the two clubs ever played against each other was June the 25th, 1921, so we're going all the way back on the time machines for this one. And South Sydney defeated St George 20 points to 9 at the Sydney Sports Ground. St George had to wait a while to get their first win over South Sydney. That didn't come until round 8, 1923, where they beat South Sydney 28 points to 5. Now, the two clubs met each other pretty early on in the piece, and their first ever finals match against each other was actually the 1927 Grand Final, where South Sydney defeated St George in the Grand Final, which was played at the Royal Agricultural Society ground, or as you probably know it today as Fox Studios in Moore Park. They used to have the showground over there in the old days, and they used to have a couple of grand finals. So that's where the first finals match between the two clubs took place. Then the following year, South Sydney once again played against St George in a finals match, and this time South beat St George at Earl Park, Arncliffe, which was one of St George's first home grounds. Then in 1931, South Sydney once again beat St George in another finals match. So once again, South ended St George's chances of winning their first premiership. In 1939, South Sydney defeated St George in the preliminary final. Of course, South Sydney went on to get absolutely smashed in the grand final by Belmead, but once again they stopped St George from potentially winning their first premiership. Then we have to go all the way forward to 1949, when the two clubs met each other in another finals match, and this time it was the grand final. And St George, finally, after nearly 20 years of attempting to beat South Sydney in a finals match, finally do so. They win the 1949 grand final, defeating South Sydney at the Sydney Cricket Ground 19 points to 12. Then we go forward to 1951, and St George beat South Sydney yet again. This time in the semi-final, they beat them 35 points to 8. A very convincing scoreline. Unfortunately, St George didn't go on to win the premiership that year. South Sydney recovered like the champion team they were back then and won the premiership. In 1953, the two clubs met each other in their third grand final against each other, and on this occasion South Sydney were too strong for St George, winning 31 points to 12. Then in 1955, once again South and St George meet. This time South beat St George in the preliminary final and go on to win the grand final the next week against Newtown. Then in 1965, I'm pretty sure a lot of people out there would know about this match. South and St George met in the grand final. St George were going for their 10th premiership in a row, and they faced up against a very young and youthful South Sydney side. And it was played in front of a grand final record crowd at the time of 70,000 people. Although you have to remember, back in those days they didn't have the same technology they do these days with electronic tickets, and there was apparently people up on top of the roofs and people, trying to break in to watch the match. So as Norm Proven said once, he reckoned that there was about 100,000 people in the ground, not 78,000. So anyway, St George went on to win that match 12 points to 8 and won their 10th premiership in a row. The following year, South and St George met each other in the minor semi-final. On this occasion, South beat St George, which resulted in St George having to play against Canterbury in the preliminary final, and Canterbury won, ending St George's 12-year domination of the competition as they were going for their 12th grand final and premiership in a row. In 1968, South Sydney defeated St George in the preliminary final to get revenge on St George that particular year, and they ended up winning the premiership that year, and which started a dynasty for South Sydney, as they'd won the year before, but this was their second premiership in a row. Then in 1971, the two clubs met each other in the grand final, which South Sydney defeated St George to win their fourth premiership in 5 years. As we all know, South Sydney didn't win another grand final until 2014, so that was their last premiership for 43 years, and they happened to do it over St George. Then in 1972, so the year after, St George got their revenge on South Sydney, eliminating them from the competition and ending their premiership defence, defeating them in the semi-final. Then in 1980 and 1984, St George easily accounted for South Sydney on both occasions in the finals when they met, and this would be, in 1984, this would be the last time that the two clubs met each other in a finals match, until 2018, when the two clubs met in the elimination final at the Olympic Stadium. On this occasion, it was a seesawing game. It was a very exciting match. St George had that game in the bag, I believe, but towards the end of the match, Ben Hunt, instead of kicking the ball in the touch, decided to run the ball in the last tackle, got caught. South Sydney went down the other end of the field, kicked a field goal, and then Adam Reynolds kicked another field goal to win the game near the full-time siren. So we kicked 3 field goals in that match to break St George hearts. And also, I'll point out that since 1982, the two clubs have met each other in the Charity Shield match, which is typically the curtain raiser for the New South Wales Rugby League NRL season. So they've met each other in that game, albeit when South Sydney were not in the competition in 2000-2001. And an interesting stat for everyone out there, South Sydney have won the last 8 Charity Shield matches in a row. So the last time St George won a Charity Shield match, you have to go all the way back to 2012 for that one. Now, another thing about the rivalry, which especially intensified it in the early 2000s, especially when South Sydney were readmitted back to the competition, was when South Sydney were controversially kicked out of the competition in 1999. St George wrote a letter to the NRL at the time stating that if South Sydney are allowed back in the competition, it would be detrimental to the competition and it shouldn't be allowed. So in other words, St George said if Souths get readmitted, it's going to make the competition weaker and it's going to make the competition look bad. So obviously South Sydney didn't take to that too well, and if you buy the Book of Feuds done by Russell Crowe, he documents that. Also, another interesting thing about the rivalry is that if you're not from Sydney, if you don't know the area, St George and South Sydney districts are actually very close to each other. So you can jump in a car and go from Alexandria and Zetland, which is South Sydney territory, and drive about 10-15 minutes south down the road, down the Prince's Motorway, and you're in St George territory, Arncliffe, Banksia, Congreve, places like that. So the districts are actually quite close to each other, very similar to Parramatta and Canterbury and eastern suburbs and south. So you have that type of a rivalry going there where it's geographically very close. But as I've said in other rivalry videos, both clubs have their main rival that they hate the most, and it's not St George don't hate South the most and South don't hate St George the most, but still it's a very competitive rivalry. I love watching these two clubs play. Lots of history, lots of success between the two clubs, and hopefully in the future both clubs can make another final and we can have a game like we did in 2018, because I absolutely love that match. But anyways, that concludes my rivalry video. I hope you all enjoyed it. If you did, please like the video, share, subscribe, comment. Did I get the rivalry right or not? Did I get it wrong? Let me know in the comment section below. As I said in my last video last night, I'm trying to get to 100 subscribers. That's me short-term goal at the moment. Can I get there? I hope so. I think I can. And let's see if we can get to 100 subscribers. And if you got some spare time, go over to my Facebook page, which is called Rugby League History. I'll put a link in the description below. And I also run the Instagram page as well, which I've just started the other week. So I'll put a link next to the Facebook description. But as always, look after yourselves, everyone. Take care, and I'll catch you all later. Ta-ra.